Damnatio ad Bestias, the cruelest death imaginable.
Imagine being stripped naked, your hands tied behind your back, and pushed into an arena where 50,000 people are screaming for your death. Across the sand, a gate creaks open, and out steps a starving lion that hasn't eaten in days.
But here's the twist. This isn't meant to be a quick death.
The Romans have drugged the animal just enough to make it aggressive but not efficient. Your death is going to be slow, painful, and entertaining. This was Damnatio ad Bestias, literally condemnation to the beasts. It might just be the most sadistic execution method ever devised by human beings. We think we know about Roman cruelty from movies and documentaries. Gladiators fighting to the death, Christians thrown to lions, the casual brutality of the arena.
But the reality of Damnatio ad Bestias was so much worse than anything Hollywood has ever shown you.
Welcome back to Chapters in History. I'm your host, and today we're diving into the darkest corners of Roman entertainment, where execution became art, torture became theater, and human suffering became the ultimate spectacle. Please subscribe for more jaw-breaking historical stories. Warning: what you're about to hear will change how you think about human nature forever. Chapter 1. The birth of sadistic entertainment. Damnatio ad Bestias wasn't just an execution method. It was entertainment designed to satisfy the bloodlust of an entire civilization. But how did Romans become so desensitized to human suffering that watching people being eaten alive became a fun afternoon activity? It started with practicality. Rome was an empire built on conquest, and conquered peoples had to be kept in line. Public executions served as warnings. This is what happens when you cross Rome. But somewhere along the way, Romans discovered that people would pay to watch other people die horribly. The first recorded beast executions date back to 1860 BCE, but they quickly evolved from simple deterrence into elaborate productions. Event organizers, called editors, competed to create the most spectacular deaths. They hired scriptwriters, costume designers, and even choreographers to make executions into theatrical performances. Think about that for a moment. Romans literally turned murder into theater. They wrote scripts for how people should die, designed costumes for condemned prisoners to wear while being torn apart, and choreographed the movements of wild animals for maximum dramatic effect. The crowds didn't just want to see death, they wanted to see creative death. A simple mauling by a lion was boring, but a prisoner dressed as Orpheus being torn apart by bears while trying to charm them with music, that was entertainment worth paying for. Chapter 2. The victims. Who deserved this fate? So, who ended up facing the beasts? The Romans had a very specific hierarchy of who deserved which type of execution, and Damnatio ad Bestias was reserved to what they considered the worst of the worst. Christians were obvious targets, especially during periods of persecution. Their refusal to worship Roman gods was seen as an attack on the state itself. But here's what's truly chilling. Many Christians were executed specifically during religious festivals, turning their deaths into sacrifices to Roman gods. Slaves who killed their masters faced the beasts, but so did free citizens who committed certain crimes. Military deserters, highway robbers, and those guilty of treason were all candidates. But the categories kept expanding as the appetite for arena deaths grew. Perhaps most horrifying were the arbitrary selections. Sometimes perfectly innocent people were condemned simply because an emperor was bored or wanted to put on a good show. Caligula allegedly had spectators thrown to the animals when there weren't enough criminals to fill the program. Commodus personally participated in beast hunts, but rigged them so thoroughly that he was never in real danger. Women and children weren't spared. Roman law technically protected women from this fate, but that law was often ignored. Children as young as 12 were thrown to the beasts, sometimes for crimes as minor as theft. The Romans justified this by claiming it was better to eliminate criminal bloodlines entirely. But here's the most disturbing part. Some people volunteered. Desperate individuals crushed by debt or facing slavery would sometimes choose Damnatio ad Bestias because it offered their families a small payment. They literally sold their deaths for entertainment. Chapter 3. The Beasts. Instruments of torture. The animals used in these executions weren't just random predators. They were carefully selected and trained instruments of torture. The Romans turned animal behavior into a science of suffering. Lions were the most popular choice. But not because they were the most deadly. Lions were chosen because they killed slowly and dramatically. A healthy lion will typically go for the throat for a quick kill, but arena lions were often starved and agitated to make them more aggressive and less efficient. Bears were even worse. Bears don't kill prey quickly, they maul and tear, often eating their victims while they're still alive. The Romans discovered that bears could be trained to perform specific actions on command, leading to choreographed maulings that could last for hours. Leopards were prized for their unpredictability. Unlike lions, which are relatively straightforward in their attacks, leopards are chaotic killers. They leap, claw, and bite seemingly at random, creating a spectacle that kept audiences on the edge of their seats. But the Romans didn't stop at natural predators. They imported exotic animals from across the empire. Elephants trained to trample victims in specific patterns, wild boars that would gore and toss their prey, even crocodiles for aquatic executions in flooded arenas. The most sadistic touch was the use of multiple animals. A single lion might kill too quickly, but 3 or 4 animals fighting over the same victim could prolong the agony for hours. Event organizers became experts at timing animal releases to maximize suffering and spectacle. Chapter 4. The Arena, Theater of Death. The Roman arena wasn't just a simple pit where animals and humans were thrown together. It was a sophisticated machine designed to maximize both spectacle and suffering. The floor of the arena was covered with sand, but not for grip or footing. The sand was there to absorb blood and make cleanup easier between events. Special slaves called arenae were responsible for raking the sand smooth after each execution, erasing the evidence of what had just happened. Beneath the arena floor was a complex system of tunnels, elevators and cages called the hypogeum. This underground network allowed event organizers to control every aspect of the spectacle. Animals could be released from multiple points simultaneously, or one at a time for maximum drama. The most diabolical feature was the lift system. Condemned prisoners would be hoisted up through trapdoors in the arena floor, appearing suddenly in the middle of the action. Imagine the terror of being lifted from a dark underground cell directly into the bright sunlight of the arena, surrounded by screaming crowds and hungry predators. But the cruelest innovation was the scenic executions. The Romans would recreate famous mythological scenes, using real people who died real deaths. A prisoner might be dressed as Prometheus and chained to a rock while eagles ate his liver. Another might play Orpheus, trying to charm wild beasts with music before being torn apart. These weren't just executions. They were snuff theater on an industrial scale. The Romans had turned murder into high art, complete with costumes, props, and dramatic timing. Chapter 5. The Crowd. Psychology of Mass Murder. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Damnatio ad Bestias wasn't the executions themselves, but the fact that entire populations gathered to watch them for entertainment. How did an entire civilization become so desensitized to human suffering? The crowds at beast executions weren't just bloodthirsty mobs. They were families on day trips, couples on dates, children learning about Roman values. Watching condemned criminals die horribly was considered a normal social activity, like going to a movie or sporting event. The Romans had elaborate etiquette around arena deaths. Spectators would wave handkerchiefs to signal approval or disapproval of a particular execution. They had favorite animals and would cheer for their preferred methods of killing. Some spectators became connoisseurs of death, developing sophisticated opinions about execution techniques. The psychological effect was intentional. By normalizing extreme violence, the Romans created a population that was desensitized to suffering and more accepting of imperial brutality. If you could watch a child being torn apart by wild animals while eating lunch, you were unlikely to question the emperor's policies. But there was also a religious component. Many beast executions were scheduled during religious festivals, turning murder into religious ceremony. The deaths of criminals and Christians were offered as sacrifices to Roman gods, with the crowd participating in a communal act of worship through violence. The most chilling detail? Many spectators brought their own food and made day-long events out of watching people die. They would picnic while humans were being devoured, treating mass murder as casual entertainment. Chapter 6. The Mechanics of Death. Let's talk about what actually happened when someone was condemned to the beasts. because the reality was even more horrific than you might imagine. The process began with the formal sentencing. The condemned would be stripped of citizenship and legal rights, making them literally non-persons under Roman law. They were already dead in the eyes of the state before they ever entered the arena. On execution day, prisoners were paraded through the streets to the arena, often wearing costumes that mocked their crimes or social status. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about humiliation and degradation before death. Once in the arena, the condemned were often given weapons, but not for self-defense. They were given props, fake swords, wooden shields, useless tools that gave the illusion of a fighting chance while providing no real protection.
Here are your weapons. Fight well for Rome. These are no weapons. This is mockery.
This false hope was part of the cruelty, making the victims complicit in their own theatrical deaths. The animals were released according to carefully planned schedules. Sometimes multiple predators were used in sequence. A victim might survive an attack by a lion only to face a bear, then wolves, then wild boars. The goal was to prolong the spectacle as long as possible. But here's the most disturbing part. If the animals killed too quickly or efficiently, arena workers would intervene. They would use spears and hot irons to drive the animals away from vital organs, ensuring that death came slowly and dramatically. The Romans had turned dying into a performance art. Final chapter. The bitter end. Damnatio ad Bestias officially ended with the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, but it took centuries to fully disappear. Even Christian emperors continued the practice, simply changing the categories of who deserved to die. The last recorded beast execution in Rome took place in 523 CE, over 1,000 years after the practice began. But by then, the damage was done. Roman civilization had normalized mass murder as entertainment, creating a cultural legacy of violence that influenced European society for centuries. Modern estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people died in Roman arenas over the centuries, most of them in beast executions. Entire species of animals were driven to extinction to supply the demand for arena deaths. The Romans literally consumed both human and animal life for entertainment. But perhaps the most chilling legacy is how easily an entire civilization convinced itself that watching people being torn apart was not only acceptable, but morally beneficial. The Romans genuinely believed they were teaching important lessons about justice, Roman virtue, and the consequences of defying the state. Damnatio ad Bestias wasn't just cruel, it was systematically, scientifically, industrially cruel. It was cruelty elevated to high art, suffering turned into entertainment, and murder transformed into moral instruction. It represents perhaps the darkest chapter in human civilization's relationship with violence and spectacle. The next time you watch a violent movie or play a brutal video game, remember that there was once a civilization where the violence was real, the suffering was genuine, and the entertainment was death itself. What aspect of Damnatio ad Bestias shocked you most? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe for more dark truths about history's most brutal practices.